Greetings, everybody. Peace and power and elevation be to all the beautiful people out there. This your girl Tiffany coming through here live in effect. Live in effect. So I want to thank everybody that been subscribing to my channel lately. I'm gonna be honest, I've been dragging this off for a while because I just wasn't really in the mood doing a lot of videos and stuff. But now I'm back in momentum to get back and start doing more videos. Okay. So I want to finish where I left off at, and this is dealing with the part 3 of epistemology. And the question becomes, what is scientific knowledge? Now, the way to address scientific knowledge is to go into the philosophy of science. Okay. So before I do, make sure you guys subscribe, like the channel, share the channel, and hit the notification bell and all that great stuff. All right. All right, so make sure you guys like the channel, share the channel, and hit the notification bell and all that great stuff. Okay. So this video, I'm going to go into is scientific knowledge. Now, I have did 2 parts of knowledge. I did the one about knowledge in itself, the knowledge of self or self-knowledge. And I'm doing the 3rd part, which is scientific knowledge. Now, scientific knowledge is considered to be different from those other 2 because the other 2 is just more so dealing with knowledge itself, dealing with the philosophy of it and just learning the epistemology, right? Whereas self-knowledge deals with the psychology, but the scientific knowledge deals with not just only philosophy, but understanding knowledge from a scientific level, from the level of science. Okay. All right. So with that being said, I'm gonna go ahead and get started. And I got some books that I want to share. So I'm gonna do that. And then we'll just go from there. All right. So the question becomes, when it comes to scientific knowledge, how do you really go about addressing it? What approach do you use to actually describe or to better explain what this concept of scientific knowledge is? Well, let's look at philosophy of science, right? Now, philosophy of science dealing with what? It's a branch of philosophy concerned with the foundation, methods, and implication of science. So the central question of this study concerns what qualifies as science, the reliability of scientific theories, and the ultimate purpose of science, right? This discipline overlaps with metaphysics, ontology, and epistemology. For example, when it explores the relationship between science and truth, philosophy of science focuses on metaphysical, epistemic, and semantic aspect of science. And it says ethical issues such as bioethics and scientific misconduct are often considered ethics or scientific or science studies rather than philosophy of science. Now, it says there is no consensus among philosophers about many of the central problems concerned with the philosophy of science, including whether science can reveal the truth about unobservable things, and whether scientific reasoning can be justified at all. In addition to these general questions about science as a whole, philosophers of science consider problems that apply to particular sciences, such as biology or physics. Some philosophers of science also use contemporary results in science to reach conclusions about philosophy itself. Now, go down to here where it says, subsequently, the coherence approach to science in which a theory is validated if it makes sense of observation as part of a coherent whole became prominent due to W.V. Quinn and others. Some thinkers, such as Stephen Jay Gould, seek to ground science in axiomatic assumption, such as the uniformity of nature, right? A vocal minority of philosophers and Paul was it Feyerabend Feyerabend, if I'm saying it right, Paul Feyerabend in particular argued that there is no such thing as the scientific method. So all approaches to science should be allowed, including explicitly supernatural ones. Another approach to thinking about science involves studying how knowledge is created from a sociological perspective, an approach represented by scholars like David Bloor and Barry Barnes. Finally, a tradition in contentional philosophy approaches science from the perspective of a rigorous analysis of human experience. And before I continue, this is the way that we have to address scientific knowledge, because we have to understand the philosophical point of it. We have to understand how, because you have to realize everything started off as philosophy. Everything started off as philosophy. Any form of knowledge that you have, it started off as philosophy. Because why? Philosophy introduces the knowledge. And epistemology is what study that knowledge. And science, which comes in to bring the application of knowledge. So basically, science is that part of philosophy that brings about the application of the knowledge, right? So when we deal with science origin, we have to deal with it from the philosophical standpoint. So this gonna lead me to doing a next video about science and spirituality. Did science come from spirituality, or did it come from philosophy, or did it come from both? So that's going to be the next title of the next video, because that's when we really have to just pull back the layers and actually get into the deep understanding of all of this. But yeah, you got to deal with the philosophy, all right? And we have to really understand, because it's like so many of us, they get caught up in get engulfed into the concept of science, but don't really like get deep into the origin of it. I mean, we deal with the research, right? We deal with the sources and information, which is great, and that's very important, but we got to understand, how did it come to that point? How did it get to that conclusion? But I'm going to continue. Philosophies of the particular sciences range from questions about the nature of time raised by Einstein's general relativity to the implication of economics for public policies. A central theme is whether the terms of one scientific theory can be intra or inter-theoretically reduced to the terms of another. That is, can chemistry be reduced to physics, or can sociology be reduced to individual psychology? The general questions of philosophy of science also arise with greater specificity in some particular sciences. For instance, the question of the validity of scientific reasoning is seen in different guides in the foundation of statistics. The questions of what counts as science and what should be excluded arises as a life or death matter in the philosophy of medicine. Additionally, the philosophy of biology, psychology, and the social science explore whether the scientific study of human nature can achieve objectively or are inevitably shaped by values and by social relation. Now, here's a tricky question. Will there always be an objective in science? When it comes to deal with scientific knowledge, right? Would you find the objectivity in it? Will you always come across the objectivity of scientific knowledge? That's the tricky question. And let me tell you why it's a tricky question. Because those of us that tend to get into studying science, we look for the objective in everything, and we don't think about the subjectivity. We don't think about how subjective science can be, right? We just thinking about, we're looking for the objective. We're looking for the answer right away. But it's tricky, because you're not going to always find the objectivity behind the scientific knowledge. You're going to find more so a subjectivity, because you got to start from a hypothetical approach, right? You got to start from a theoretical approach before you actually get into doing all the experiment and come up with the data and conclusions, etc. Right? I know this may go over many people's head. All right, so now let's get to the part on here where it says introduction defining science. That's Karl Popper in 1980s. All right, so now let's go to the part where it says distinguish between science and non-science. It's referred to as the demarcation problem. For example, should psychoanalysts create creation science and historical materialism be considered pseudoscience? Karl Popper called this central question in the philosophy of science. However, no unified account of the problem has won acceptance among philosophers, and some regard the problem as unsolvable or uninteresting, right? Martin Gardner has argued for the use of a Potter Stewart standard. I know it when I see it for recognizing pseudoscience. Early attempts by logical positives grounded science in observation, while non-science was non-observational and hence meaningless. Popper argued that the central property of science is possibility. That is, every genuinely scientific claim is capable of being proven false, at least in principle. An area of study or speculation that masquerades as science in an attempt to claim a legitimacy that it would not otherwise be able to achieve is referred to as pseudoscience. Fringe science, though oftentimes a fringe science become mainstream, even developing into a paradigm shift or junk science. All right, so physicist Richard Feynman coined the term cargo cult science for cases in which researchers believe they are doing science because their activities have the outward appearance of it, but actually lack the kind of other honesty that allows their results to be rigorous. So I will come back to the Wikipedia source later. I, I will come back to that source later. And all right, peace to the chat. Shout out to the chat. Shout out to the chat. So I'm gonna come back to the Wikipedia source later, but I want to say this. For many of us that trust into science, right, which is no problem, but check this out. How many of us, has actually gone through the process of being able to falsify the information that um that articles and and research has been put out on the internet. How many of us has actually gone through that process to falsify? Not many of us. Not many of us has actually been able to go around and falsify the information or use falsibility, right? Or try to prove the information to be false. So basically what happens is we just trust and rely on the sources and articles that's being put out online, right? But who to say that those sources cannot be proven wrong? Who to say that those sources may or may not be pseudo? Who's to say that? We don't really know, right? We don't really know. We just know that it sounds good. We know that it sounds true, but we have not went through the experiment of going to the laboratories or going doing the groundwork, which is such as archaeological work or anthropological work, to actually to back it up and to verify this. So all we doing is primary sources, secondary sources, right? And we use other third-party sources to back up all the information. But as far as doing the field research is concerned, many of us has not done that. We have not done it. We have not done it to say that is true. That is absolute. We can only go by what is presented in articles, what is presented in research papers, and that's the only thing we go by. Because many of us cannot even afford to go into the labs and test the results in the laboratory. Many of us cannot afford to go and do archaeological research. It's just plain reliance on information instead of experience. That's it. That's it. That's all you're doing. You're relying on information instead of experience. That's all you're doing. That's all you're doing, basically, relying on the information because you don't have the experience. And the reason why I'm on this for real, is because people have made a religion out of science. They have made religion out of science as science the end all to be all, and that's not the case. I mean, again, science is a great information to go to. It's a great subject to study, but science cannot give you as much information either. Science can't give you all the information that you want because there's a lot, and what you're going to come to find out that a lot of stuff can be subjective in science. It could be based on subjectivity, then the objectivity. Why? Because it can always be a challenge. Scientists can always challenge other scientists' information, or this scientist may come up with something different from what the other scientists came up with. Okay, so this scientist may be able to support their subjective point of view and may be able to prove this scientist over here wrong. So 9 times out of 10, it can come from the state of subjectivity. Then the objectives, because if it came from the objectives most of the time, then I don't think there would be a reason to do a lot of ongoing research, right? There will be no reason to do a lot of ongoing research. But because you have to do a lot of ongoing research, that means that chances are the information that's being presented is more subjective than being objective, right? Yeah, I'm gonna go the definition of science. I think I did. Didn't I? Yeah, I did go over the definition of science. Hold on. No, no, definition. All right, so here's the definition of science. Okay, I'm back though. I'm back. My bad. Hold on. Can't you hear me now? If you can hear me, let me know you can hear me. All right, I'm back. So science is a systematic enterprise that builds and organizes knowledge in the form of testable explanation and prediction about the universe, right? Okay, so now let's go to the earliest roots in the history of science can be traced to the ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia in around 3000 to 1200 BCE. But let's go into the history of science then. So the history of science covers the development of science from ancient times to the present. It encompasses all three major branches of science: natural, social, and formal, right? So again, it says the earliest roots of science can be traced to ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia around 3000 to 1200 BCE. Their contribution to mathematics, astronomy, and medicine entered and shaped Greek natural philosophy of classical antiquity, whereby formal attempts were made to provide explanation of events in the physical world based on natural causes. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire, knowledge of Greek conception of the world deteriorated in Latin-speaking Western Europe during the early century of the Middle Ages, but continued to thrive in the Greek-speaking Eastern Roman. All right. So basically, if we really want to break down what science is, science basically deals with to know. That means to have general knowledge, right? Or to gain general knowledge. That's all science is. And as I was saying before, science is dealing with the application of knowledge, right? That's basically about it. If we really want to break it down. But as the article mentioned, there's various forms, there's major branches of science. There's the natural science, the social science, and the formal science, right? Okay, so let's look at what formal science is. So what does formal science deal with? Formal science is a branch of science studying formal language discipline concerned with formal systems such as logic, mathematics, statistics, theoretical computer science, artificial intelligence, etc., etc. Okay, that's formal science, right? So that deals with formal language, and natural science deals with what, like biology, physics, etc. And social science deals with psychology, anthropology, and sociology. All right, so there's various branches of science. But you know, it's so funny. A lot of people say that psychology and sociology are considered as soft science, and I think that that's not really what it is. It's not soft science. It's just more so science that's dealing with from the social aspect of understanding human behavior and human characteristics and how human function in society in the world. So the question is, do you consider ecology as soft science? Because ecology deals with the relational organism and their environment, right? Last time I checked. But all right then, let me see this comment right here. As I know it, science is the development or creation of knowledge. That's basically what it is. Yeah, it's development of knowledge. Basically, because you developing knowledge with science, you bringing the application of the knowledge, right? But at the end of the day, where does science really come from? If we go back to its origin, it traces back to philosophy. Now I have some article here. Okay, so this article is the first article I posted up right here. Is one I want to show y'all. It's called The Social Dimension of Scientific Knowledge. All right. So let's just go into this paragraph real fast. It says, study of the social dimension of scientific knowledge encompasses the effects of scientific research on humans' life and social relations, the effects of social relation and values on scientific research, and the social aspect of inquiry itself. Several factors have combined to make these questions salient to contemporary philosophy of science. These factors include the emergence of social movements like environmentalism and feminism, critical of mainstream science, concerns about the social effects of science-based technology, epistemological questions made salient by bit science, new trends in the history of science, especially the move away from internalist historiography, anti-normative approaches in sociology of science, turns in philosophy to naturalism and pragmatism. This entry reviews the historical background to current research in this area and features of contemporary science that invites philosophical attention. So let's go down to say bit science, trust, and authority. The second half of the 20th century saw the emergence of what has become known as bit science, the organization of large numbers of scientists bringing different bodies of expertise to a common research project. The original model was the Manhattan Project undertaken during the Second World War to develop an atomic weapon in the United States. The theoretical and experimental physics located at various sites across the country, though principally at Los Alamos, New Mexico, worked on sub-problems of the project under the overall direction of J. Robert Oppenheimer, while academic and military research have since been to some degree separate. Much experimental research in physics, especially high energy particle physics, continue to be pursued by large teams of researchers. So research in other areas of science as well, for example, the work comprehended under the umbrella of the Human Genome Project has taken on some of the property of bit science, required multiple forms of expertise. So again, this website, I recommend people always go on this website because it deals with philosophy. So if you want to look more about scientific knowledge on this website, you can, and you can do so. Now, I'm not here to totally discredit science to say that science don't have no type of value, because it does. And there are some things in science that cannot be disputed or cannot, you cannot go against. Some things in science cannot be disputed, and some things you cannot go against in science, and that's understandable. All right, but again, a lot of stuff in science can be based on subjectivity, and a lot of stuff can be challenged as well. You know what I'm saying? So science can be just as theoretical and philosophical as anything else, and that's all I'm trying to get at. All right. And I'm a person that loves science. I love anthropology. I'm a person that loves anthropology, psychology, and sociology. All right. But I do know that at the same time, things can always be challenged. And things can always be proven to be false. All right. And I know as a person that might just look at information, I don't have enough information to actually falsify the source that's being presented, because I'm not in those laboratories. I'm not doing the groundwork. I'm not doing the field research to discredit. So I'm only going by the information that I come across or that I read upon. And if it seems more logical to me and it seems more reasonable, then that's what I will accept. And then there's things that I will have question for. From your understanding, is spirituality scientific? I'm gonna save that question. I'm gonna save that question for later. Let me tell you why. Because that's gonna be another video that I'm gonna do about spirituality and science. So I'm not gonna answer that as of right now, because I'm gonna do that. I'm gonna make that a whole separate video about that. Okay, I'm gonna make a whole separate video on that. But that's a great question. But I'm just going to save that later. I'm going to save it later. That's all I'm going to say. I'm just going to save it later, because I want to be able to make sure I compile enough information to actually answer that question. All right. I'm gonna save it for later. All right, so then here's the next article. The next article is on understanding the nature of scientific knowledge by Susan Carey from the Department of Brain and Cognitive Sciences, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and Carol Smith, University of Massachusetts, Boston. It says one important goal of science education is to help students understand the nature of scientific enterprise itself. All right, so going down here, it says one important curricular goal of science education is to help students understand the nature of scientific enterprise itself. All right, etc., etc., etc. But let me skip on down. All right, so go down to here where it says epistemology of science. So it says a third lecture derived from more direct studies of students' verbalization. So basically talking about the whole purpose of the whole main reason why students should understand about the nature of scientific knowledge, right? Okay, but let me just go ahead and read it for the sake of it, even though it's pertaining about students in grade level from high school and college, but it still be good to actually it's still good to actually like look into this. But anyway, it says one important curricular goal of science education is to help students understand the nature of scientific enterprise itself. This goal is important for several reasons. First of all, students can master only a small fraction of scientific knowledge in the course of their schooling. But as citizens, they must adopt position on public issues that turn on controversial points. Hence, the successful science curriculum would have fed an interested and get an entrance in science that underlies lifelong learning and a value of the kind of knowledge that is acquired through a process of careful experimentation and argument, as well as critical attitude towards the pronouncements of experts. Involving students in the process of doing science and talking with them explicitly about its nature are thought to be central to cultivating these interests, values, and attitudes. So skip on down says exactly what we view of the nature of science do we wish to give a student is common practice for current textbook to portray scientists as engaged in a process that depends on careful observation and experiment and to teach students some of the skills involved in careful experimentation. However, overlooked in these accounts is any discussion on the role of the scientist theories in the process. Instead, mention is only made of scientists' specific hypotheses or beliefs about the world. Keyword hypothesis or beliefs. Because see, that's where it starts off. Again, it starts off. I'll surely make sure that I do that. So I'll make sure I put the link in there when I do the video. All right. Now, anytime something start off as a hypothesis and a beliefs, then that should let you know that it start off as subjectivity. And that's how things come off in science. And in general, it just start off from a subjective point of view. Before you get to the objective, you're going to have the subjective. You're going to always have subjective. I mean, you cannot have the objective without subjective. All right. It has to coexist with each other. How can't you have objective and you don't have no subjective? Or now you can have the subjective without the objective because at the end of the day, it's just subjective, but you can't have the objective without having subjective. Let me slow it down and let me say it again. Let me repeat it. You cannot have the objective without the subjective. Now you can have the subjective by itself alone without the objective, because at the end of the day, it'll just be subjective. But in order to have the objective, you must have the subjective. You must have the subjective. Keep that in mind. All right. Yeah, just keep that in mind. Just keep that in mind. In some account, these hypotheses are seen to be a simple consequence of unbiased observation and experiment. Whereas in other, it is acknowledged that scientists may have hypotheses that motivate their doing a particular experiment. However, in both cases, these hypotheses are thought to be tested in unproblematic and straightforward ways by the data of critical experiments, and scientific knowledge is portrayed as the steady accumulation of a set of confirmed hypotheses. Okay. As Hosen, Nadu, and Nasatos, and Strike and Posner claim, such a view is essentially an inductivist or empiricalist view. The origin of scientific knowledge lies solely in data about the world. And it goes on to say, we argue along with the just mentioned authors that it is important to present students with a more constructivist epistemology of science, one in which students develop an understanding that scientists hold theories that can underlie the generation and interpretation of specific hypotheses and experiments. We want them to come to understand that our knowledge of regularity in nature is a consequence of successful conjecture rather than its precursor, and that an adequate theoretical perspective is essential to both observation and experimentation. Thus, without challenging students' faith that theories may ultimately reflect reality, we may be able to help them see that theories are a large-scale intellectual construction that constitute the scientist's understanding and guide the day-to-day activities of scientists. Such an understanding would help students understand why scientists do experiments, why there can be legitimate controversies in science, and even why learning science is difficult. And I'm not gonna lie, science is a difficult subject, but it's the most important subject, but it's a difficult subject as well. Especially when you start dealing with biology and chemistry, that's very difficult. And physics, because that's when you really got to really have the patience to actually learn. If you don't have the patience, then you're not going to be able to learn them. You're not going to be able to gain the proper understanding. And that's another reason why people use anthropomorphism, personification, or quasi-allegories to explain the scientific knowledge to those who may not be able to comprehend the technicality of it. So it may come off as being pseudo, but it helps a person to become more lateral, meaning that they can become more creative and they be able to gain better understanding of the scientific terminology or modern science just by using quasi-allegories or quasi-allegories, anthropomorphism, and personification. So that people gonna see a lot. So when these scientists have conversation or when they're discussing something or they're trying to explain something, they always use examples. They always use illustration. Why? Because illustration makes it a lot easier for the minds, for the listening audience to be able to comprehend, to gain a better understanding. So if somebody want to explain quantum physics, right, they may use some form of illustration to explain quantum physics. Why do they use illustration to explain quantum physics? Because it makes it a lot easier for that person to understand what quantum is and what it means to deal with quantum physics, right? And instead of just explaining from its technicality, because if you're using technical terms to try to explain something, then it would go over the heads of many individuals and they would not have any interest or any desire to learn the subject. Yes, that makes it easy to understand. Absolutely. All right, so now I just want to introduce you guys to some books. This book is called What is Scientific Knowledge? Introduction to Contemporary Epistemology of Science by Kevin McLean and Costa. I'm not even going to try to say this person's last name. All right. But yeah, this book gets into what is scientific knowledge and deals with the epistemology of science, etc. So this will say, how is scientific knowledge generated? Let's look at that. How is scientific knowledge generated? So how many scientists does it take to have knowledge? That is a good question by Jerome de Ritter. So right here where it says scientific knowledge in collaborative context. Before we look at features of scientific knowledge specific to a collaborative context, we ought to get a better grip on scientific knowledge as such. Throughout this chapter, I rely on a characterization of knowledge that is widely endorsed in epistemology. According to it, knowledge is warrant true belief, where warrant is a general epistemically good making property that makes the difference between a belief being merely true and its constituting knowledge. And constituting knowledge. If a belief is warranted, that might mean, among other things, that it's not luckily true when it is true, that is reliably produced, or that is based on good grounds. Now it goes on to say, why is scientific knowledge held in such high regard? What sets it apart from non-scientific knowledge? For one, it is knowledge produced through scientific research. That is certainly true, but it tells us little about what is supposed to be good about scientific knowledge. A better starting point is the thought that scientific knowledge is a high-grade knowledge, that is, knowledge that satisfies demanding epistemic standard, and that as a result is highly reliable, robust, or well-established. There are different ways of understanding this general ideal. One tempting but mistaken reading is to think that scientific knowledge is the most certain knowledge that we have. What did I say about that? Let's read that part again. There are different ways of understanding this general ideal. One tempting but mistaken reading is to think, and I'm just going to zoom it up, is to think that scientific knowledge is the most certain knowledge that we have. That is false. However, quantum mechanics or the standard model of particles physics are among the most firmly established results of science. But my knowledge that there is coffee in the cup in front of me, or that 2 + 2 = 4, is even more certain. That is because, unlike scientific knowledge, such humdrum beliefs are not based on complex inference from observation mediated by instruments and technology. Hence, they do not suffer from the inevitable uncertainties that attach to such inference. Now, then it goes on to say a better way to think about this issue is that scientific knowledge is the most reliable knowledge we have about certain subject matters, to wit, the underlying nature of reality in human beings. Science is our most reliable means for discovering non-obvious or non-superficial factual truth about the universe and ourselves. Non-scientific methods for forming beliefs about such matters tend to be unreliable. Just consider the many false beliefs that people have had throughout the ages about the origin and age of the universe, about the ultimate constitute of reality, human nature, and so forth. Although not infallible, science is significantly more reliable in the long run when it comes to the such matter. At the same time, we shouldn't overestimate how reliable science is. There is by now solid evidence that more than half of published scientific results in the biomedical sciences, psychology, neuroscience, and the social science are false. What did I say? I said that earlier, right? Such unreliable published results are not scientific knowledge in the sense in which I am using that phrase here, because they lack appropriate warning or false. Then it goes on to say that scientific knowledge is high-grade knowledge also means that scientists scientific knowledge ought to be able to justify knowledge claims. Having scientific knowledge requires not only that scientific beliefs are produced by reliable methods, scientists should also understand these methods and be able to explain them, providing reasons for thinking that their knowledge claims are true. If a biologist claims to know what the key drivers of random genetic mutation are, she ought to be able to explain herself, provide evidence, or point to literature where evidence is presented. Having scientific knowledge thus requires having access to and grasping the reason why your beliefs are likely to be true. This is why consulting oracle that reports true claims with perfect reliability will never produce scientific knowledge. All right, so, and I'm just going to leave it at that. I'm not going to go any further, but that's just enough said right there. So if you guys can get this book, it's called The Scientific Knowledge. What is Scientific Knowledge? An Introduction to Contemporary Epistemology of Science by Kevin McLean. All right, and Costa, and I don't know how to say the last name of this individual. Right, so that's one book that you guys can check out. And this book right here is called The Evolution of Scientific Knowledge from Certainty to Uncertainty. Please repeat that part on consulting the oracle. Hold on, let me go back to it. Let me go back to it. Okay, so going back to this paragraph, it says if a biologist claims to know what the key drivers of random genetic mutation are, she ought to be able to explain herself, provide evidence, or point to literature where evidence is presented. Having scientific knowledge thus requires having access to and grasping the reason why your beliefs are likely to be true. This is why consulting an oracle that reports true claims with perfect reliability would never produce scientific knowledge. So okay, to explain that, just because somebody say that they were able to make prediction and to be able to foreshadow your future or whatever the case may be, right? Does not necessarily mean that it's true, because at the end of the day, it could still be hypothetical. It could still based on somebody's beliefs, all right? It could be based on observation, but does that mean that because of what they believe or what they perceive and what they foreshadowing, does that necessarily mean that it's going to be true? No, because now you have to look at the probability. Well, what's the chances of that ever happening? What's the chances of that ever occurring? How can that be proven? The only way it can be proven if somebody was able to live into that future, right? And somebody was able to go into that that time period to experiment, right? But other than that, that's just basically it's basically hypothetical. So basically what the article is getting at, that paragraph is getting at, that it's hypothetical and it's just merely based on belief, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's very scientific and it's very objective, because in order for that to be objective, you have to actually go through experimentation process. That's all. That's all that article is saying. Okay, so now going to the next book about the evolution of scientific knowledge, right? This book came out in 2016, right? All right, so it goes into the introduction, challenging time, evolution of Galilean and Newtonian scientific thinking, a rational shift in the narrative, why epistemology, desire to know what is epistemology, modern science, the crisis of complexity, Then goes into the birth of modern science. Then goes into the pre-Galilean science, etc. All right, so as you can see, there's a lot going on in this chapter. So it says the translational science uncertainty. So let's take a look at modern science. Let's look at chapter 1, why epistemology? Why epistemology, right? And then we're going to go down to modern science. So let's just look at desire to know. So the opening line of Aristotle's metaphysics states all men by nature desire to know. But what does it mean to know? While one might wish for a universal answer to this question, none as yet has been forthcoming. As we understand the question, what it means to have knowledge depends on one's standpoint. Moral knowledge is of a different kind than scientific knowledge. Even in science, the domain of scientific knowledge and what is accepted as authentic knowledge, meaning that it is accepted as true, has changed dramatically over time. So it says the domain of scientific knowledge for Aristotle was much smaller than it is today. He could not make observation of the atoms or of distant galaxy. He could not observe the genes and proteins in a cell, nor could he measure electrical impulses in the brain. His concept of truth was limited by his ability to observe and measure, but it was also limited by the mathematical system he had available to present the behavior he viewed. It is naive to think that our concept of knowledge in today's world of quantum physics and microbiology would be the same as it was for Aristotle in 340 BC, what it was for Newton in 1687, or what it would be in 2500 or 2500. Okay, which that will be in the near future. So scientific knowledge relates to the manner in which the mind formulates and operates on ideas concerning nature. These must ultimately be related to our senses that provide the data from which the neural system formulates ideas. My idea of a rock is not outside my mind. Something out there that results in sensation that in turns result in the idea of a rock. Such ideas are the raw material of theories that describe the interaction of the ideas. And if a theory is valid, it should produce consequences that can be checked against future sensations. The fundamental point is that theoretical operation in the mind correspond to physical operations in nature that are not directly experiment, but whose activity is reflected in the new sensation, resulting in new ideas concordant with outcomes the original operation predicted. This very general description of scientific knowledge has been developed over many centuries and is not Aristotle's view. All right, so again, and then it goes down to talk about modern science. It says starting in the early part of the 17th century, a radical new understanding of natural science took shape. On the one hand, Francis Bacon proposed order of observation in the context of experimental design. On the other hand, Galileo contended that scientific knowledge must be constituted within mathematics and not be bound by the need to explain matters in ordinary language. Isaac Newton manifested Galileo's conception with his laws of motion, which he proclaimed free of non-empirical metaphysical notions such as substance and causality. This was indeed a new science. What is gravity? Who knows? All that matters is that science provides mathematical description of behavior. It would no longer be required to satisfy the human desires for explanation in a deeper reality. And it says mathematics was not new to science. Archimedes, the greatest scientist of antiquity, was a great mathematician, and this was reflected in his scientific thinking. Now, however, instead of supporting a theory whose status as authentic knowledge was rooted in causality, mathematics was the theory. Knowledge was the constituted within it, and its validity depended solely on its ability to make prediction confirmed by observation. The birth of modern science was the greatest revolution in human history. It radically changed the human condition because It alters man's perspective on himself and nature. Now, I always say this, and I always make this argument, and I'm gonna stand on this argument. All we know about the universe is that the universe is mathematical, right? It's mathematical, okay? We know that. That's all we know. But everything else, we really don't know. Now, we don't know exactly if the universe was around from the very beginning, right? But we know that the universe was already here before we got here as humans. That's all we know. Okay? So we can't give exactly the year of the universe. We can't exactly say that. We don't know exactly if the universe is 13.5 billion years old. We really don't know, right? But we do know that it's been around for a long time. We don't know exactly when the universe is going to end, right? We can only make prediction, but we don't exactly have the answer to that. So this goes back to the question that I asked in my previous videos about the supernatural and all of that, right? How can't you say, or how do you know for certain that there is no supernatural, or there's no what we call divine energy behind this thing called the universe? How do we know that? How do we know if you can only observe 5% of the universe, right? And everything else is either dark matter or dark energy. So if everything else is dark matter and dark energy, then you can't really so much make prediction based on that. You really don't know too much of what's going on because it's pretty much void in the naked eye. So you can't really see, you can't see the matter because it's dark, right? And you don't know what type of energy it is. So the only thing you can describe it is dark energy because you don't know, you can't see it. Or it's dark matter, but you don't know what that matter is because it's dark. So you only got 5% of the universe that is observable in the eye of the human being. So whatever is observable in that eye, in the naked eye, that's the only thing you can go by. So, so that's why, when people that are theists or atheists try to make an argument whether there is a creator or a supernatural force or whether is it or not, then they both can be challenged. They both can be challenged on both sides. So just like the theists can be challenged on their beliefs, so can the atheists be challenged, because you really don't know what is behind this thing called the universe, right? You don't really know what type of force it is. You don't know. So you're only going by your subjectivity. And that was the point that I was getting at in my previous videos. Okay, but the question is, what is the spirit eye? So when you say the spirit eye, what does that mean? What does that mean to have a spirit eye? That still goes back to beliefs. That still deal with belief system. What does that mean to have a spirit eye? One may question that. What does that mean? Remember, the article is not based on belief. It's a look into the future, which is a product of the past and present. Okay, so, but what's the chances of that future ever happening? See, now you got to ask yourself once again, we got to look at, okay, where's the chance of that future ever going to happen? Because we got to remember, life is based on probability, right? Life is like a game of dice. Life is probability, which deals with chances. So now the question is, what are the chances that ever going to likely happen? And how that can be proven to happen? The only way it can be proven if somebody experiment, meaning that if somebody lives in the future. But until then, you're just only foreshadowing. You see what I'm saying? If you're following me. Yeah, but going back to the question about the spirit eye, what does that mean to have a spirit eye? Because when you say spirit eye, you got to explain that. What does that mean? Because that still goes back to beliefs at the end of the day. Because this is a question that an average individual may ask you, what do you mean by a spirit eye? No, but I have not. Have I ever constituted oracles before? No, I have not constituted an oracle before. But I do know this: if an oracle, the oracles are basically making a prediction about the future, but you have to be able to prove that that's going to happen. You have to be able to live long enough to actually see a future happening. I do know that. You have to be able to live long enough. If you're not going to live long enough, then chances are the future is not going to happen. So I hope I'm making sense. I know, again, this is challenging, right? It's very challenging. And these are the questions that's going to be asked. And these are the answers that got to be answered to those questions. So I'm not knocking spirituality. I'm as a matter of fact, I use some form of spirituality myself, but at the same time, I know that those things are going to be challenged. How do you know that the oracle is true? How can you verify that to be true though? See, these are the things that can be challenged. Again, you gotta be willing to go up to the challenge. How do you know that the oracle is true? How do you know that the oracle is accurate? Again, if life is based on probability, right? And life is dealing with chances, then what are the chances that the oracle is true? What are the chances that the oracle is not true? How do we know that? Only way we'll be able to know if we actually experiment, right? But because you got to experiment in order to know whether the oracle is true or not. Am I correct? But yeah, let me go ahead and but again, how do you know? Okay, even if you do use it, how do you know that? Again, you got to deal with the probability. You got to deal with chances. What are the chances that it's true? I mean, this is something you have to think about. So let me just go ahead and go back to the book title. So the name of the book is called The Evolution of Scientific Knowledge from Certainty to Uncertainty. Okay. By Edward R. Dorfery. And this book right here is very interesting. Let me try to zoom that in. So this one's called Cultures Without Culturalism, Making a Scientific Knowledge. Cultures Without Culturalism, Making a Scientific Knowledge, right? By Corinne Camilla and Evelyn Fox Keller, right? So it says Cultures Without Culturalism, Invoking Culture in an Analysis of Behavior in Financial Markets. So, this is another book if you guys are interested in checking it out. Okay, so let's go on to the last one. Now, this book right here is called The End of Science. Now, this book seems like it's very interesting. The End of Science by John Horgan. Facing the Limits of Knowledge in the Twilight of Scientific Age. All right, so this one's called The End of Physics, The End of Cosmology, The End of Evolutionary Biology, The End of Social Science, and The End of Neuroscience. And this one's called The End of Chaplexity, The End of Limitology, Scientific Theology, and The End of Machine Science, and The Terror of God. Well, let's see what this book is about. Let's go into the introduction. All right, so right here it says The End of Progress. So it goes in 1989, just a month after my meeting with Roger Penrose in Syracuse, Gustavus Adolphus College in Minnesota held a symposium with the provocative but misleading title, The End of Science. The meeting premise was the belief in science rather than science itself was coming to an end. As one organizer put it, there is an increasing feeling that science as a unified universal objective endeavor is over. Most of the speakers were philosophers who had challenged the authority of science in one way or another. The meeting's great irony was that one of the scientists who spoke, Gunther Stent, a biologist at the University of California at Berkeley, had for years promulgated a much more dramatic scenario than the one posed by the symposium. Stent had asserted that science itself might be ending, and not because of the skepticism of a few academics, sophists. Quite the contrary, science might be ending because it works so well. Stent is hardly a fringe figure. He was a pioneer of molecular biology. He founded the first department dedicated to that field at Berkeley in the 1950s and performed experiments that helped to illuminate the machinery of genetic transmission. Later, after switching from genetics to the study of the brain, he was named chairman of the neurobiology department of the National Academy of Sciences. Stent is also the most astute analysis of the limits of science whom I have encountered, and by astute, I mean, of course, that he articulates my own and inchoate promotions. In the late 1960s, while Berkeley was racked with students' protests, he wrote an astonishingly persistent book, now long out of print, called The Coming of the Golden Age, A View of the End of Progress, published in 1969. It contended that science, as well as technology, the arts, and all progressive cumulative enterprise was coming to an end. Most people, Stent acknowledge, consider the notion that science might soon cease to be absurd. How can science possibly be near an ending when it has been advancing so rapidly throughout this century? Stent turned his inductive argument on its head. Initially, he granted science advances exponentially through a positive feedback effect. Knowledge begets more knowledge, and power begets more power. Stent credited the American historian Henry Adams with having foreseen this aspect of science at the turn of the 20th century. So Adams' law of acceleration, Stent pointed out, has an interesting corollary. If there are any limits to science, any barriers to further progress, then science may be moving at an unprecedented speed just before it crashes into them. When science seems most muscular, triumph, potent, that may be when it is near death. Indeed, the dizzy rate at which progress is now proceeding. Stent wrote in Golden Age, make it seem very likely that progress must come to a stop soon, perhaps in our lifetime, perhaps in a generation or two. Certain fields of science, Stent argued, are limited simply by the boundness of their subject matter. No one would consider human anatomy or geography, for example, to be infinite indoors. Chemistry, too, is bounded, though the total number of possible chemical reaction is very great and the variety of reaction that can undergo vast. The goal of chemistry of understanding the principle governing the behavior of such molecule is like the goal of geography, clearly limited. That goal arguably was achieved in the 1930s when the chemist Linus Pauling showed all chemical interaction could be understood in terms of quantum mechanics. So again, this book seems to be very interesting. This is something that you have to, this is a book that you will have to read and you will have to ponder. What I mean by that, that means that you have to sit down and read and actually think about and just actually just ask several questions. It's an interesting title. So is it necessary the end of science, or is it science going through a transitional phase? So I think what the author may be arguing about regard to the title, the end of science, I think the author is basically trying to say that science is going through the transitional stage, going through the transition from where it's at now to become a totally different field in the future. And I think that's where the author is getting at. But again, that's a book that you will have to actually read, and you will have to ponder. You'll have to wonder. You have to come up with questions. So peace to brother born eternal Lord Allah. Shout out to you, brother. Peace be upon you. Shout out to you. Yeah, so that's something that you have to ponder. You have to sit back and you really have to ponder, well, when is the end of science taking place? Or does it necessarily mean that science is going to end in its totality, or is it going through a transitional stage to become something else? That is a great one. So I strongly recommend this book. And then as you read this book, I think that this will be able to like get people thinking and get people asking questions and all that good stuff. So now let me go back to my Wikipedia source that I had earlier. Okay, so let's go back to philosophy of science, right? Let's get back to the philosophy of science. Because I left off somewhere in this article. All right, so let me go to where it talks about scientific explanation, right? So say scientific explanation, a closely related question is what counts as a good scientific explanation. In addition to providing prediction about future events, society often takes scientific theories to provide explanation for events that occur regularly or have already occurred. Philosopher has investigated the criteria by which a scientific theory can be said to have successfully explained a phenomenon, as well as what it means to say a scientific theory has a explanatory power. Now let's look at what is explanatory power. Let's go there. So explanatory power is the ability of a hypothesis or theory to explain the subject matter effectively, which it pertains. The opposite is explanatory impotence. In past, various criteria or measures for explanatory power have been proposed. In particular, one hypothesis, theory, or explanation can be said to have more explanatory power than another about the same subject matter. Right, as you can see, it says if more facts or observation are accounted for, if it changes more surprising facts into a matter of course, if more details or casual relation are provided, leading to a high accuracy and precision of the description, if it offers greater predictive power, if it depends less on authorities and more on observation, if it makes fewer assumptions, if it is more falsifiable, more testable by observation or experiment, etc. So again, explanatory power is the ability of a hypothesis or a theory to explain the subject matter effectively to which it pertains. So at the end of the day, let me go ahead to the philosophy of science. Let's walk through this. So it goes on to say, one early and influential account of scientific explanation is the deductive nomological model. It says that a successful scientific explanation must be deduced the occurrence of the phenomena in question from a scientific law. This view has been subjected to substantial criticism, resulting in several widely acknowledged counterexample to the theory. It is especially challenging to characterize what it meant by an explanation when the thing to be explained cannot be deducted from any law because it is a matter of chance or otherwise cannot be perfectly predicted from what is known. Wesley Salmon developed a model in which a good scientific explanation must be statistically relevant to the outcome to be explained. Others have argued that the key to a good explanation is unifying disparate phenomena or providing a causal mechanism. So now it goes down here to talk about justifying science. So as you can see, there's a woman right here standing next to chicken, the chicken tent or whatever it is. It said the expectation chickens might form about farmer behavior illustrate the problem of induction, right? Although it is often taken for granted, it is not clear at all how one can infer the validity of a general statement from a number of specific instances or infer the truth of a theory from a series of successful tests. For example, a chicken observes that each morning the farmer comes and gives it food for hundreds of days in a row. The chicken may therefore use inductive reasoning to infer that the farmer will bring food every morning. However, one morning the farmer comes and kills the chicken. How is scientific reasoning more trustworthy than the chicken's reasoning? That's a great question. One approach is to acknowledge that induction cannot achieve certainty, but observing more instances of a general statement can at least make the general statement more probable. So the chicken would be right to conclude from all those mornings that it is likely the farmer will come with food again the next morning, even if it cannot be certain. However, the remain difficult question about the process of interpreting any given evidence into a probability that the general statement is true. One way out of these particular difficulties is to declare that all beliefs about scientific theories are subjective or personal, and correct reasoning is merely about evidence should change one's subjective beliefs over time. Again, it's what subjective, right? That's where everything started off. Now it says some argue that what scientists do is not inductive reasoning at all, but rather abductive reasoning or inference to the best explanation. In this account, science is not about generalizing specific instances, but rather about hypothesizing explanation for what is observed. Okay, as discussed in the previous session, it is not always clear what is meant by the best explanation. Occam's razor, which counsel choosing the simplest available explanation, thus plays an important role in some version of this approach, right? To return to the example of the chicken, would it be similar to suppose that the farmer cares about it and will continue to take care of it indefinitely, or that the farmer is fattening it up for slaughter? Philosophers have tried to make this heuristic principle more precise in terms of theoretical parsimony or other measures. Yet, although various measures of simplicity have been brought forward as potential candidates, it is generally accepted that there is no such thing as theory-independent measure of simplicity. In other words, there appear to be as many different measures of simplicity as there are theories themselves, right? And the task of choosing between measure of simplicity appears to be every bit as problematic as the job of choosing between theories. And I'm just going to leave it off right there. But this is a good article right here. So look into to understand scientific knowledge, right? You will have to study the philosophy of science. Go into that concept. Okay, so that's it, and that's all. Now, I'm going to leave out with a conclusion. And speaking of chicken, this is the argument that I will make as far as the origin of humanity or origin of organism in general, right? I know people heard this. What comes first, the chicken or the eggs? If the egg came first, then how did it come into existence? How did the egg come into existence? If the chicken came first, then how did the chicken come into existence? So the argument that I will make as far as human is concerned, who came first, man or woman? Man or woman? If man came first, then how did he come into existence? What brought about man? How did man get here? If woman came first, then how did she get here? Okay, so if you argue that the chicken, then how did the chicken come here? How did the chicken come into existence? What brought about the chicken? If you argue that the egg came into existence, what brought about the egg? How did the egg come into existence? So if you argue that man came first, right? Then how did man come into existence? What brought about man? If you argue that woman come first, then how did woman come into existence? So this is the question that we always have to ask, right? When it comes to the challenge of humanity. That's a good argument. Both man and woman came at the same time. That's a good argument. So that's a better argument than saying that man came first and you don't have a proof that man came before woman, or to say that the woman came first and you don't have any factual proof to prove that the woman came first. So it's best to say that both came at the same time, right? But how do we know exactly they both came at the same time? You see what I'm saying? But it is logical to say that. It is logical to argue that both man and woman came at the same time, because we don't know which one came first. And so the whole point to get at is you can't coexist without one another. You can't coexist without man. You can't coexist without a woman. So in order to have a man, you have to have the woman. In order to have the woman, you got to have a man, because both of them got to coexist with each other, right? To bring about human population. So the same way, to have the chicken, you got to have the egg, and to have the egg, you got to have a chicken. And otherwise, you can't have one without the other. So again, scientists can't really answer the question as far as who came first, as far as human concern. They can't really answer that question because they have not gone that far back to actually say man came first or woman came first. The only thing they can say is we don't really know who came first, but we know that man and woman came around the same time. Right, basically balance. That's all you got to have. You got to have balance. So I'm saying this to say that scientists, just like anybody else, can make prediction. They can use subjectivity until they can prove their subjectivity to be true, and they can use some form of objective. If they don't have the objective to validate their subjectivity, then it's just going to be subjective. But if they have the objective to validate, then it can turn into the objective. But at the end of the day, scientists ain't no different from anybody else, because their information can be challenged just like anybody else's information can be challenged, right? Their sources can be challenged just like anybody else's sources can be challenged. Now, certain things you cannot go above, certain things you cannot question, because certain things is just what it is. It's just a natural phenomenon, right? But certain theories and certain hypotheses that's been taking place and certain scientific research can be challenged and can be asked and it can be questioned. But if you do challenge, how do you go about using falsibility? Are you able to falsify? That's the key thing. Are you able to falsify what is challenged? So let's just keep that part in mind. Let's just keep it in mind. So there's something else I wanted to say. I think, my thing is we have to be careful how we go about relying on scientific research. There's nothing wrong with studying scientific information. You just have to be careful how you go about relying on scientific information and who it's coming from, because some scientific information can come from a state of biases. Some scientific information come from a state of biases. It don't matter who said it. So It can come from a state of biases. It can come from a state of being political, etc. So that's the part that we have to be careful, and it can be very tricky. So that's why I don't blame those who may not be, I don't blame those who are spiritual and who may not be into, who may not study a lot into science like that, or not into the scientific field. I don't blame them for asking questions. I don't blame them for asking how reliable is scientific sources. If my spirituality is not very reliable, right, then what makes you think that science is 100% more reliable? So they have a right to ask questions. Those who are into the spiritual school of thoughts, those who are into religious school of thoughts, and those who are just not into either one, they have a right to question scientific knowledge as well. You know, and that's a good thing, because see, that goes to show that you're able to think. If a person tell you that you're not able to question scientific knowledge, then actually they're misleading you and they're wrong. So if that person cannot explain the scientific knowledge, then that means that they don't have enough understanding to actually give about explanation. They just only going by the sources that's being presented, or the information that's just being documented. That's the only thing they going by. They don't have a way to actually explain it. So that means they don't have enough understanding to actually explain the source. So it's always good to challenge not only just those who into the spiritual school of thoughts and religious school of thoughts, right, or in the philosophical school of thought, but also those who dealing with scientific knowledge or in the scientific school of thoughts as well. Everybody has to be challenged. Everybody has to be questioned, because how do we operate in the world without asking questions? How do you go about having critical thinking if you don't ask questions? There's one thing that's part of being critical, is to ask questions. That is the most key component to have critical thinking, is questioning things. If you don't question things, then you're not being critical. Then you're not a critical thinker. I'm gonna say that again. If you're not asking questions, right, then you're not being critical. And that's the key to it. So you always got to question things. You always got to question your own beliefs at times. You got to question your own thoughts. You know what I'm saying? You got to question the legitimacy of your own thoughts. Sometimes you got to do that, and it's okay to do that. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with challenging your own thoughts, certain information that you may come across, or certain ideas, or certain things that you may believe, right? There's nothing wrong with putting that up to challenge. Because that's going to only make you better. It can only make you be able to explore more, and to be able to branch out more and do more research, or do more reading, and being able to see where you messed up on your own ideas, and you can be able to go back and stand correct and challenge yourself. So as humans, we don't all think alike. We all don't think the same. So only thing we're here to do is learn from each other and go from there. That's the only thing that we're here to do. Right? The whole thing is, in life, you gotta learn how to live, and you live to learn. That's all you can do in life. So life itself don't come with a manual book, right? It don't comes with like instruction of how to go about living life. It's something that you got to figure out. You know what I'm saying? This is why people create culture, because culture brings about evolution. It continues the human evolution process. So without culture, how do you go about having human evolution? Yeah, you can have biology, but what good is biology if you don't have a culture? What good is biology if you don't have a culture, if you don't have a cultural foundation to stand on? That's just something to really think about. So with that being said, ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for tuning in, watching, for those of you that were watching, and thank you for subscribing to my channel. If you like my channel, go ahead and share, and hit the notification bell, and check out all my previous videos that I have done so far in the past week. And I will come back with more subjects. All right. So until then, y'all take it easy on yourself and be safe. Peace and power and elevation be to all of you. This your girl Tiffany, and I'm logging off saying deuces. Thank y'all so much. All right. Be safe. Be easy. All right. Deuces.